What's up guys, it's Double Zug. So I have not made a video in quite some time here just because, as I'm sure you've noticed, MoP Classic has been going through a little bit of a content drought with the first tier overstaying its welcome a little bit, not being the most fun tier to heal on farm, just because the healer counts go so low unless you're one of those like main healers and you get to 2 or 3 heal, or you're like, in a guild that can really aggressively drop healers, or you don't mind off-speccing. It's just not super exciting to heal some of these raids on farm. You can see from this footage I have been dabbling a little bit in retail, just doing like one-day mythic. I've also been dabbling a little bit in fellowship, which I may make some videos on in the future potentially. I think that game is interesting, it's not mind-blowing by any means, but I think if you do enjoy H+ or M+, if you do dabble in retail at all and you like that type of gameplay, it's definitely a good game to just kind of dabble in. There's not a lot of like leveling or any of that BS. So if you're less of like an RPG MMO player and you more just like the end game content, worth checking out. It's like $20 or something, so not a huge investment. All right, so that said, Throne of Thunder I think is going to be a great, super fun raid to progress on. It's also potentially going to be a little bit more fun to heal on farm, I think. There's no like, MSV to be totally invalidated by the next 2 raids, and MSV having like some of the more fun bosses, kind of a little bit of a bummer there. Throne I think is going to be super fun. It's also kind of nice that the PTR that just got announced is on weekdays. I assume most players raid on weekdays, so you can just convert one of your raid days into a PTR day, which is kind of cool. And, more people are going to be seeing PTR this time, I think. We also got a little bit more warning than we normally do. This wasn't like, sprung on us on a weekend the few days before, which is really, really nice. Kudos to Blizzard for that one. And so in preparation for that PTR, we'll be releasing some like loose BIS lists. Now, obviously, like the super serious guilds will probably be testing in progression gear, which is just going to be like this phase BIS. But if you want to go in there with some Throne of Thunder gear, you want to get that gear off the vendors, or you're just building like a template character and you don't have any gear to transfer onto the server with, I will be releasing some just loose BIS lists at some point before then. This video, though, I'm just going to be loosely talking about how gearing is going to work in Throne of Thunder. I'm going to be going over the tier set bonuses, this tier for all the healing specs, and just talking about how good they are. So in Throne of Thunder, gearing is going to work very similarly to how it does this tier, except, obviously we're not getting the like time-gated release of the raid in chunks, so we will have access to like all the tier sets and all this gear just right away from the first week. So we will still have coins, so you can bonus roll. The item has changed though. It's going to be a Mogu Rune of Fate instead of an Elder Charm of Good Fortune. So you can't stack up your Charms of Good Fortune to get a bunch of extra bonus rolls, but what you can stack up are the charms to buy the coins with. So if you don't need to coin any more items, stop spending your charms and you can just stack those up to not have to do like dailies or pet battles or whatever you have to do to get more of those charms. And the other mechanic we had to discuss here is Thunder Forging. So this is just a random RNG proc when loot drops to drop 6 eye levels higher. So normal heroic loot is going to be 435 unupgraded, and then you can upgrade it 8 eye levels higher, and then Thunderforged gear is going to drop at 541. This also applies to normal. Obviously, just 6 extra eye levels on normal is going to be 528. There's also Raw Den, which is a heroic only boss, which drops all of its loot as Thunderforged, so it's not like an RNG mechanic here. So again, this just complicates BIS lists a lot and like how you acquire gear. Sometimes a Thunderforged piece with good stats will be better than a heroic piece with bad stats. Just know your stat priorities. You can sim your gear on QE Live, or you can use my sheets to try to figure out these little things. For the BIS list here though, what I will be doing is, because we don't exactly know how Thunderforging is going to work, if it's just Blizz-like, that means it's just going to be pure RNG. You just have to hope to drop the items Thunderforge, or obviously coins. Your coined items can also proc as Thunderforged. I think it's relatively likely that we will get some kind of RNG protection. Maybe it's time gated, maybe a few weeks after the raid releases, we get access to a limited amount of items that allow you to just directly Thunderforge something. We've seen a lot of quality of life changes like that in Classic so far, and I think it's relatively likely, although obviously not certain. There could be some like H+ thing where you do some heroic pluses. Maybe, on the currency vendor for H+, you can buy an item that you can just apply that will directly Thunderforge something for some amount of shards. That will dramatically affect how accessible these Thunderforged items are. Obviously, if you have a raid that can kill Raw Den, you will always get access to those items Thunderforged, because that's just how they drop. So for my BIS list, what I'm going to do is release one list that just has Raw Den items on it, and then I'll probably do a second list with like full Thunderforged heroic items. This is particularly relevant for healers because a lot of the healing tier set bonuses are not super highly impactful, and tier cannot Thunderforge. So that means that if you have a Thunderforged item in that tier socket that has like good stats on it, it could potentially be worth taking over tier, even dropping like your 4 set or your 2 set just to get that eye level boost. Eye level is very strong. And again, especially if those items have better itemization than the tier itself. There are some healing specs which actually do want their tier set bonuses relatively highly, but kind of like half of them don't, half of them do. It's very similar to this tier where the tier sets are not super impactful for healers. This will fortunately change a little bit in Siege. Siege gives us some pretty splashy, like interesting, more impactful set bonuses for healers specifically. And also the trinkets in Siege are just like super insane and pushed and have some wild effects on them, whereas the trinkets in Throne of Thunder, although there's some very insane trinkets for DPS, like the ramping main stat procs, the really wild stuff like Rune of Reorigination, which is just absolutely insane for some specs that can snapshot things, as well as just kind of like wild unique effects like Vision of Lei Shen, which gives you 100% crit chance for 4 seconds on a PPM. So, DPS get access to some really wild, splashy, super powerful and interesting trinkets, whereas healers, we kind of just get very generic stuff like, Horadon's Last Grasp, which is just kind of a stat stick. There's a lot of just, basic stat stick stuff going on here. For the healers that can proc DPS trinkets, there's a little bit more play here. However, generally you're going to be competing for those with your DPS and not likely to get them highly. So unless you can coin one of those DPS trinkets, you're probably just going to end up taking some of these higher eye level, just, healer trinkets, which are a little bit boring, unfortunately. All right, so the last thing here that's going to affect gearing for Throne of Thunder are the legendary metagems. You get access to these after you complete a bunch of the legendary quest chain, so not going to be relevant for like week 1, week 2 prog, but later on in farm, these will be pretty powerful. The first one is the healing coded one. This is going to give us 324 intellect, so, like 100 more intellect than the normal one, and you lose that 2% mana or the crit multi, which, is crit multi is like pretty good for a lot of these specs, so it's a little bit of a loss there. But the effect that you gain from this is a chance on proc to make your spells free for 4 seconds. All right, so the way that this metagem procs is it has, as far as I can tell from like just looking through Wowhead comments and as well as the wiki, has a 1.4 RPPM. What RPPM means, and this is actually how a lot of like the new trinkets are going to work. I think pretty much all the new trinkets from now on have PPM rather than like ICD. PPM is just like, you can kind of read through this if you want to. It's basically just increased by your haste. So you're going to get like 1.4 plus your haste and as a chance to proc. And then like regardless of how many, like if you're dot class, if you don't hit frequently, you don't heal frequently, you should expect to get your RPPM regardless. So it's kind of like normalized in that way, which is pretty significant. And also you can track this proc obviously and cast like high mana cost spells when it's up. So you can get a little bit of extra value that way from this. So this is generically just going to be quite strong for all the healers. All the healers use mana, and all the healers have ways of dumping mana pretty effectively. And then the second metagem here, which is like the caster damage coded one, is 324 crit. So this does not give you intellect. You lose 200 intellect for taking this, or 300 versus the healing metagem. So, it's not 2 to 1. You are going to be losing a decent amount of value, losing that intellect for crit. And what this proc does is increases your spell haste by 30%. So this is kind of like just a bloodlust, right? So it doesn't tell us a duration or a PPM on the thing. And the way that this one procs is actually a little bit more complicated than the mana metagem here. You can see it has a 1.18 base RPPM. However, it has a totally different like coefficient on its proc rate, like per spec, per damage spec, and I'm not actually sure how this interacts with healers, if all healing specs just get the base RPPM or not. But regardless, this is going to be quite powerful for healers, specifically like Resto Shaman that does damaging abilities and also likes haste, although also potentially for Disc Priest for DPS maxing, especially in farm or on shorter fights where you do actually want that haste, where it's actually good. But for HPS, pretty much the only healer I think that really wants this is going to be Resto Shaman. And then there's the melee DPS option, which could potentially be relevant for like Mistweaver. If you're DPS maxing on a Mistweaver, this could be useful. Although I kind of think the mana one's interesting for Mistweaver because you can potentially run like Glyph of Uplift or something and dump a huge amount of mana in 4 seconds with that. And these are a pretty significant boost over the normal metagem for basically all the specs. So kind of powerful here. All right, so that's all the metagem stuff out of the way. Now we're going to go just really quickly through all the tier set bonuses. We're going to talk about how much value they actually give you, whether or not you're going to be wearing 2 or 4 set. So we're going to start with Shaman here. Shaman is kind of starting a little bit on the low note, honestly. These tier sets are very, very weak. You are probably going to end up running 2-set Resto and 2-set Ellie. Again, if you don't have access to Thunderforged gear. There's not a huge amount of Thunderforged gear in these slots that's really powerful for Shaman. So you probably are just going to end up running lots of tier. And the Ellie tier gear is very well itemized in these 2 sockets. So it's basically free to get this tiny little bit of extra damage you get from this 2-set, kind of similar to this tier. So for the restoration tier bonuses, the 2-set is your healing stream totem now heals an additional target for 25% of its normal amount. This is okay. It's like about a 1.5% maximum healing increase. So not like massively impactful. The 4-set is your Ancestral Awakening now has a 50% chance to trigger on non-critical heals. So if you've been looking through like WoW Wiki or something, you might have seen this set bonus, which says the 4-set is your haste is increased by 5%. This was changed later on in WoD because they removed Ancestral Awakening in WoD. Unfortunately, that's not the tier set we're going to get. If it was 5% haste, it would be pretty strong. But this Ancestral Awakening set bonus is actually very, very, very weak. It's like a 0.5% HPS increase at the maximum. And even if you fully change your filler to pressing Healing Wave instead of like Chain Heal, it's still only less than 1% bonus. And the problem with this too is like the more, even if you're in a 10-man and you're pressing more like spotty heals, you're doing more Healing Wave, more Surge, more Greater Healing Wave, this just does not affect your totems. It doesn't affect Healing Rain. It doesn't affect Riptide Hot. It doesn't affect so much of the majority of our healing. And also there's a non-synergy with crit, because the more crit you have, the less this thing benefits you, because it only benefits non-crit spells. And if you are healing in that spottier way, you want to be playing a little bit higher crit anyways. So you get some negative synergy there. It also has negative synergy with Healing Surge, because Surge has such a high base crit chance with Tidal Waves. So a very weak tier set. However, the 2-piece is pretty free, because as you can see in the chest, there's only 1 piece that's Thunderforger that's better. That's just very slightly better. And then for the gloves, there's a significantly better Heroic and Heroic Thunderforge piece here, but I think overall that 1% is going to be just fine, and it's going to be, some RNG to get those Thunderforge pieces anyway. So I think this like double 2-set setup here is super free. The Ellie gear is very well itemized, so you don't have to, get that great RNG to have a very, very close to this setup here for Resto Shaman. All right, so let's do the pre-specs next here. So this 2-set is going to follow a common trend amongst a lot of the healing set bonuses here, which is that like a periodic effect or a hot or something like that increases as it bounces or as it ticks. So this is Prayer of Mending, heals for 10% more each time it jumps to a new target. So pretty strong. Prayer of Mending is good for both Specs, Disc, and Holy. It's a little bit stronger for Holy, just really strong. It's also a reason not to run the Palm Glyph here that takes away 1 bounce, just because you want all your bounces here. It's also another reason to really play to get maximum bounces out of your palm in this tier. This 2-set's about a 2% healing increase for Discipline and about a 2% for Holy. A little bit better for Holy though, a little bit worse for Disc, but just very, very small margins there. And really has no effect on playstyle. The 4-set is a little bit more interesting. It's your Penance and Circle of Healing. So Penance and Circle of Healing have a very similar CD, like around 8 seconds on average. And those have a 40% chance to summon a golden apparition. So it's like a shadowy apparition, but just not shadowy, which moves to a nearby ally and heals for an additional like 100,000. So 40% chance on our, main cooldown filler. That's relatively high priority for both specs. Decent here. So I couldn't find any good information about whether or not this has a spell power coefficient. So this is something I do need to test on the PTR just to see like what's Blizz like, what we're actually going to get in Classic. I didn't do any testing on this on private server. I just don't really trust that data, and we're getting PTR really, really soon here. But assuming it just heals for 100,000 plus crit mastery, all that stuff, this is going to be like a 2.5% increase for Holy and about a 3% increase for Discipline. So decent little bonus there. However, again, a lot of these pieces have pretty bad itemization, and so especially for Disc that really doesn't care for haste at all. Holy values Spirit a little bit higher. So for Holy Priest, I do think it's going to be a little bit, less bad to run 4-piece here. So for Discipline, for pure HPS or Disc, I would run something like this that has 2-piece healing, and similar to Resto Shaman actually runs 2-piece Shadow. There are a little bit better heroic gloves for Discipline here over the Shadow tier, but I just put the tier gear on there because it's basically equivalent in terms of HPS. And, if you ever off-spec or anything, you just have that 2-piece ready to go. But, obviously, if you can grab these gloves and you don't want the Shadow tier gear, or if it's a little bit more contested, you can just run these gloves instead. And with Thunder Forging, you know, there's some options here that will get you a little bit of upgrade over that Shadow tier. However, I do think this Healing 2 set is relatively well protected for Disc because I just think the Thunder Forged options in these 2 slots are not better enough to really beat out that like 2% from the Palm. When it comes to Holy, your setup's going to be very similar here to the Disc HPS setup with just 2-piece healing. However, as I said before, you can run like a 4-set setup with Holy, and you will get slightly worse itemization on your gear. You'll get a little bit more haste, which is like totally wasted, but that, you know, 3% gain will, you know, basically be a wash. I don't think there's going to be a significant difference either way. So if you like the 4-set, if you want to run it, if you get access to that tier gear over the off pieces, you can run this just fine. However, again, if you do ever off-spec Shadow, I would err towards the 2-piece setup just because it allows you to use your gear a little bit more efficiently, not really lose a lot of healing, and gain access to that Shadow gear. All right, so next we're going to talk about Mistweaver here. So Mistweaver, the 2-set, is along the similar trend line with the Palm tier set we just saw. Your Renewing Mist heals for 15% more each time it travels to a new target. So Renewing Mist has 3 charges. It's going to travel twice. So you're going to get 15% of the first one and then another 15% of the next one. So this is going to be like a 2 to 3% increase to healing. This will get a little bit better if you go a little bit higher on the haste breakpoints for Rem, which you could potentially end up doing in this tier. So 2 to 3%, not terrible. It's also like relatively free to get this 2-piece just because there's decent itemization on some of these tier pieces as well. The 4-piece here reduces the cooldown of our Thunder Focus T, so that's the ability that resets all of our Rems. It goes from a 45-second cooldown to a 40-second cooldown. So on like a 6-minute fight, this is going to be 1 extra use of Thunder Focus T if you use it on cooldown. This is not like hugely impactful. It's also kind of hard to like estimate the value of in the way I set up my sim, but I think it's not great. I think it's like, you know, 1.5, maybe 2% maximum increased healing. So not hugely impactful. And I think you could probably easily drop this for like some Thunder Forged gloves and potentially like these Thunder Forged leggings. Those 2 combined is probably going to be better than the 4-set. However, generically for most players, you're probably just going to end up running this 4-piece. One thing I have to test here as well is if you retain the % bonus increase to the Rems after you refresh them, which could potentially provide some synergy between these 2 set bonuses and boost their effectiveness a little bit, although not hugely significantly. All right, so next here we have Holy Paladin. Holy Paladin's 2-set just increases the healing done by our Daybreak ability by 50%. This is a huge percentage increase, but Daybreak doesn't do that much healing, so it's, you know, about a 2 to a 2.5% increase. It's a little bit better for Selfless Healer than for Eternal Flame, but overall, you know, not hugely significant, but quite nice. A lot of this Paladin tier gear is very well itemized for us, so we don't really sacrifice much to get this 2-piece. However, for particularly the chest as well as the legs, there are some significantly better itemized pieces if you can get Thunder Forged, or even just like some heroic drops here. So the 4-piece has to be relatively strong to make us want to grab it, especially if we have those Thunder Forge options. The 4-set here is increases the healing transferred to your Beacon of Light target by 20%. So 20% more beacon healing, quite significant. It's actually significantly better for Eternal Flame than for Selfless Healer, just because of how Eternal Flame, its healing profile works, which is just a lot heavier in terms of beacon. This is also really, really nice just to make your tank feel incredibly safe. So qualitatively, it has a little bit of a benefit there. I would just generically go for this 4-piece. Although if you are super lucky and you get like Nova Binder, Thunder Forged, and potentially, you know, like the Master Swap leg plates, Thunder Forged, you could swap to just running 2-piece, especially if you're running Selfless Healer. But for Eternal Flame, and I think most players play Eternal Flame on Paladin, this is a pretty significant bonus that's also qualitatively quite nice. So actually a pretty powerful tier set here, although again, not super exciting or playstyle warping. And then lastly, but definitely not least, we have Resto Druid. So ironically, kind of similar to this tier, I think Resto Druid has the strongest tier set bonus, especially the 2-piece here. So, and it also has really well itemized tier generally. So you are probably definitely going to be running 4-piece on Druid here. The 2-piece is very powerful. It's Swiftmen's Ground Effect, which is Efflorescence, which is not attached to Swiftmen if you run the glyph, but it says Swiftmen in the tier set, which is a little bit confusing. So your Efflorescence can now heal up to 4 targets instead of 3. So 3 to 4, big increase. This is like a 7 to 8% healing increase alone. Also, one thing to mention here is I haven't tested whether or not this works on your Force of Nature Treant Efflorescence. If it does, it would make Treants a little bit better, although I still think so. I think you know, they won't be competitive. But if you really like playing the Treant talent, then this will make it a little bit better. I have not tested this. This is something I will test on PTR when this gear is available. So this 2-piece is like hugely impactful. It's by far the best 2-piece of all the healers. And so getting 2-piece on your Druid healer is going to be relatively high priority, although I assume you're probably going to be prioritizing most of your tokens on progression to DPS and tanks. But, you know, out of all the healers, I think this is the most impactful one. The Forset is another in this chain of periodic effects increasing over time. It says the healing done by your rejuvenation increases by 6% each time it causes healing. So one thing I have to test here is if the first tick benefits by 6% or if the first tick is just base. If the first tick does get that 6% benefit, it's about a 23-24% increase to rejuve healing overall with like the 6 tick breakpoint. But if the first tick is just baseline, it's only like a 16 to 70% increase. So pretty significant increase to rejuve here. Overall, it's like a 3.5% increase to healing. One thing to mention here is this does affect, like if you have a Soul of the Forest regrowth, it ticks like 10, 11, 12 times or whatever, you will get extra benefit from that, but it's not enough to make Soul of the Forest rejuve good. So it doesn't really matter. This is also something that encourages you to go to that next rejuve breakpoint, but I'm not sure if it's really reachable in a way that's like actually good for your healing. So I default to just gemming and gearing for like more mastery over haste here, but it is possible that getting that second rejuve breakpoint is worth it. We'll just have to see in the future. I haven't done like the math, but it is kind of interesting. And speaking of gemming mastery, one thing to mention here is that I have updated like the just base stats on all of these sheets to the Thorn of Thunder around Abyss without too much Thunder Forging item level. And basically every healer has a breakpoint somewhere in here in Thorn of Thunder gearing where they do want to start gemming for secondary stats over intellect. What I'd recommend doing is I'm probably going to go into progression with mostly just main stat gems. However, as I get new gear, I'll just start gemming secondary stat on that new gear, and then over time you'll just naturally transfer over to those secondary stat gems. And to very quickly go through the list here, for Druid, you're either going to be gemming pure haste to get that second rejuve point if it's worthwhile, or you're going to be gemming full mastery. For Holy Paladin, it's quite simple because you're basically already gemming full mastery, but that's just going to become even more true for SH, as well as I think for EF, it's probably also just worth it gemming full mastery at this point, unless you're going for a particular haste breakpoint. For Mistweaver, it's a little bit more complicated because we care so much about DPS, and our HPS is not super affected by a lot of these stats unless we're like fully spending all of our mana. However, it could potentially be worth to just start gemming crit. I think you might lose a little bit of DPS that way, but especially I think with like the mana meta gem, there could potentially be usefulness for Glyph of Uplift, in which case you have a lot of leniency to dump your mana. Otherwise, if you're running Rushing Jade Wind, it's obviously quite good to gem Critical Strike for that extra mana as well. For Holy Priest, I think you probably just start gemming Mastery, and for Disciplined Priest, it's quite complicated because Disciplined Gearing is quite complicated. For pure HPS, you want to have a decent balance between crit and Mastery. Mastery looks a lot better in terms of raw HPS, but it's a little bit less protected from overhealing. And crit also contributing to your damage is quite strong, so I think most priests will end up going for a balanced approach and gemming full crit. Also for DPS specifically, for long fights, Spirit is actually better than Intellect for DPS. And on shorter fights, you want to have enough haste that you can spend all your mana, and then after that you want Spirit. So you want kind of a balance between Spirit and haste for the fight length, and then third you want crit. Very different gearing strategies for Discipline. I will release different lists for different things, but generally speaking, if all that's confusing to you and you don't care about min-maxing everything, you can just gem straight crit, and that will be probably like the most balanced and useful overall approach. And then for Restoration Shaman, there's a couple of different options here. You can actually just go full crit. Crit is very powerful, or you can go full haste. I think both options are fine, honestly. As long as you have low spirit and you aren't prioritizing mastery over crit and haste, you're going to be just fine in your Shaman. And I think the most common approach you'll see on Shaman is probably going to be just like gemming haste, although crit is also quite powerful. Particularly for 10-man, where you might be doing a lot more single target and spot and tank healing, that crit is going to be quite strong. All right, so that's it. That's my super basic TOT gearing thing. I will, again, be releasing some BIS lists for each spec previous to PTR in the next couple days, so keep an eye out for that if you are interested. Thanks for watching. See ya.
Swobu, Zug Zug.